AI isn't something sort of the future over the next hill. It's the present. It's already here, in Britain, changing lives. A chance to turbocharge growth, create the companies of the future, and radically improve our public services.
So welcome to the latest edition of The High Ground, the Air and Space Power Association podcast with myself and Greg Bagwell. We're looking at artificial intelligence here, and this is a massive topic. Is it the answer to the maiden's prayer or some expensive distraction for defence? You know, with resources tight, an urgent need to transform. Are we at warfighting readiness, and how do we maximise our potential for warfighting, particularly since some of our adversaries are actually involved in war today, are experimenting fast and making this. So what is the potential and the limitations of artificial intelligence? Joining us from Helsing, global leadership in AI-enabled precision mass and autonomous systems across a whole load of defence domains. Delighted to welcome an old friend, Benjamin Tallis, Senior Government Affairs Manager for the company, and Martin Binderman, Head of their UK Air and Space Programmes. Both of you, very warm welcome today.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be with you and Greg on the high ground.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, welcome.
So if we can kick off, I guess we could end up talking for hours about this. We just don't have the time. But one of the challenges, inevitably, is that there is a war raging in Europe at the moment, in Ukraine, and there are so many people in the defence space trying to draw all sorts of lessons of where we should invest, where we shouldn't invest. So what do you think we can learn, and what have we got to be careful about learning about the conflict in Ukraine, about Rising Lion, Midnight Hammer, lots of these other things as well, when it comes to AI?
Ukraine has made virtues of many of the necessities that it has. It's used a lot of new systems like drones to fill in for stuff it doesn't have, like artillery at scale. But what we've not really seen yet is using new technologies to their full potential to change the way we actually fight. And that's why, I mean, all of this is not just about the technology, it's about what we do with it that actually counts. And so, I mean, you can look at historical examples of that. If you think about when the tank was introduced in 1916 as an infantry support weapon, it didn't really do very much. But 2 years later, when the Army and the RAF pioneer the first kind of combined arms warfare, proves incredibly effective in the 100 Days campaign. And of course, later gets perfected 20 years later, sadly, by the Germans with Blitzkrieg. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is introduction of new tech, but not introduction necessarily of new ways of fighting. And we also have to be careful about saying drones, a term that perhaps now obscures more than it illuminates, because that's used to describe everything from those little hardware, things like the quadcopters, first-person view drones, FPVs, all the way through loitering munition systems, and even up to collaborative combat aircraft, CCAs.
A really good practical example of both going through the data and then turning sort of hardware into software problems, if you like, is from Ukraine, where they have, you know, an acoustic network as part of their integrated air and missile, you know, defense, 500 sensors, you know, set out across the country, where if the Russians change the acoustic signature of their Shahed drone, how do they pick that out? Well, they use AI. They use AI to pour through that data, to pick out the needle. They're able to then and understand what that signature looks like. And because those 500 sensors are linked in a mesh network, they can update those sensors in one software drop across the entire network, where previously you might have had like a patch that someone has to go out to each of the sensors and upload.
Yeah, no, I get that. But I mean, I've recently been out to Ukraine. I ended up spending quite some time talking to a young chap who's part of the drone brigade. And he talks a lot about the rise of autonomous systems. I think you're quite right. I recently bought a little drone, you know, one of these 249 gram, and incredibly capable. And as a former pilot, it scares me that people can just fly these without any sort of license. But these autonomous systems, how AI is being folded in, there's some fascinating conversations happening about how that sort of rapid evolution of technology going on. They would use drones, they were jammed, so they did terrain mapping radar, they were jammed, they now use fiber optic, you know, and AI is now providing, and interesting, I saw in the news this morning, you know, that the Russians are making advances into Pokrovsk. Why is that happening today? Because there's thick fog over the region. Drones that would normally be taking everybody out are not doing that. So the Russians are charging in and taking advantage of mass. So I do wonder, Yes, I take that your point, but surely AI-powered drones or AI-powered autonomy is going to be a really powerful capability for the future.
Well, exactly. And that's about differentiating the kind of drones you're talking about from those little quadcopters to properly AI-enabled strike drones and AI-enabled reconnaissance drones, which could operate the strike drones, for example, in heavy fog. They could operate in bad weather conditions because they have a different kind of targeting, because they actually use AI to overcome jamming, to overcome electronic warfare. And so again, that's why it's important to really differentiate what we're talking about there. But I think it's important to also say we're not really actually fully using the capability of AI that we have with those systems at the moment.
Yeah, because as a former Air Force guy, you're obviously much more looking at this through the war fighter's lens.
Yeah.
Is there anything that frustrates you about what we're taking about lessons learned? As a warfighter, how do you see Ukraine being a model or otherwise for the future?
So it's interesting you talk about this morning about how fog and how the weather can undermine some of the technology we have. You know, in a similar way, the Russians making the advances immediately thought, well, it's like the Germans in the Battle of Bulge making their advances under the weather, and that negated air power advantage that the Allies had. So there are some things that don't change in warfare, and the nature of warfare doesn't change, and we need to then identify where we can apply the technology and where we can apply the AI to in the character of warfare to drive it forward. And I like General Rainey's view of this. He's head of the US Futures Command. He talks about learning lessons that are either revolutionary, evolutionary, or is it an anomaly? Is it something that's just so particular to that current conflict that it's instructive, but it's not necessarily how we would want to fight? And there are two key things that I think that come out of current conflicts, not just Ukraine, but also Nagorno-Karabakh and also, recent conflicts in the Middle East. And one is data-centric warfare, the proliferation of a deluge of data, everything is a sensor, the transparency of the battlefield, and the ability to be able to wade your way through that data to detect the key insights. That's the first thing. And how can we build upon that and turn, where possible, hardware into software problems? And then secondly, is, as you've already talked about, the rise of autonomous systems and how that has exponentially increased, particularly through Nagorno-Karabakh and in Russia, Ukraine, powered by AI and robotics.
And I think that's a good segue into where that then fits in from a UK perspective, because it's undeniable that what Ukraine has done, and clearly the imperative is almost one of necessity, but what they've done is accelerated things far quicker than perhaps we would have done in a peacetime scenario. And I think there's a danger here in the UK that we see it as the magic bean that fills the gaps that we've allowed to sort of come to fruition over the last few decades of underinvestment. So how do we square off experimentation in peacetime, recognizing what we're seeing in Ukraine, and how do you then bring that into a procurement cycle that is genuinely reactive and acting in a way that you start to see things being brought in far quicker than perhaps we have done hitherto?
So I think, Greg, you mentioned experimenting, which has been absolutely key to any change that's been seriously made in the history of military innovation in peacetime. And so actually being able to experiment with these new technologies at scale, getting them into the hands of the warfighter, in order to test them, to train them with them, to see what they can actually do. That's going to be key to not only understanding which technologies work and which technologies don't, but also to then developing the new ways of fighting that we actually need to make the most of them. And from then you can actually then see, well, we need to procure differently. We need to procure differently in terms of accepting incomplete capabilities to be delivered and then co-developed by militaries together with the companies who are developing these, because it's the companies that are at the cutting edge of most of those developments. And so that requires a different kind of risk sharing in procurement than we've seen before.
Bring that back into the experimentation discussion. We did a podcast last week which looked at augmented reality training for combat pilots, because how do you train with a CCA drone? How do you train with 1,000 drones? Because you're not really going to want to stick them up in the air, or you might not be able to. And so how do you square off? And Sean and I remember being promised network-centric warfare for probably a decade or two, and it never really arrived. So how do we build confidence and trust in that this much more complex, but in theory much more effective ecosystem functions, and you practice it to the point where you trust it?
In my mind, Greg, to that, it comes down to your simulation environment. And it comes down to how good is your simulation environment, how effective is it, how much does it replicate the threat that you're facing, the operational environment that you're going to be operating in. And certainly, the RAF's leading the way in this in terms of their thinking of Gladiator and having the ability to have various platforms plug in, but it also provides, the ideal testbed for these new capabilities, where the digital environment now is getting to the point where technology now can accurately represent, what it would be like for real. So more and more training and more experimentation. I mean, there's no reason why, and the Americans have been doing this for the past 3 years in their joint synthetic environment, joint simulation environment. You could put autonomy agents in that are ultimately going to fly these CCAs. And you could have them in your simulation environment now. So you could be experimenting with what is your force mix going to look like? What is the risk appetite you're prepared to take? What missions and tasks could you almost delegate to a CCA right now? And how could you optimize that human machine teaming for the future? And almost like test, train, experiment, prepare in the simulation environment and validate in the live.
I think we all buy that in terms of how you would be able to train. But when we trained in a simulator, we then got in the real aeroplane and turned it on and proved that it worked for real. And perhaps 78% of the time it did, and the other 20% it didn't. And that was just your availability rate. But with these sorts of systems, I suppose it's a bit like we already do with our weapons. It's in a box, you break it out, and you trust it to do a 98, 99% success rate. And I guess it's how do you get to proving that level of quality?
Yeah, I mean, you'll need to step out of the simulative environment as well and into the real world too. I mean, once you've got comfortable with it in the simulator, then actually exercising with it in real life to a degree for limited periods or with limited numbers of these things, but to actually show how they work together and how they work with you as pilots and how that feels as a pilot, because there's no substitute for that for sure. And that's again been history of military innovation, actually getting this stuff working in realistic exercises, realistic testing and training has been shown to be the way that we actually then start to develop ways that we're comfortable with of fighting and that are effective and can use new technology to really deliver advantage.
And I guess the $64 million question for me is, can you do that today? Is it just a level of lack of risk or appetite to do so? Or are we still months, years away from being able to do this at scale to the level that we would need to warfight?
So I think you can do it today, and we've demonstrated to a limited extent how we could do it today, in terms of what we achieved with our partner Saab in terms of integrating our AI capability into the Gripen. Whereby we sat down with them and said, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And 8 months later, we integrated it and was flying on a live production combat aircraft, and that was done through developing the capability in our simulator, porting it over to the Gripen simulator, where you can fine tune it to that specific platform characteristics and performances, building the trust with the pilot, building that comfort with the system that ultimately led to a version of it being put into the Gripen, and pilot hands off and the AI is controlling the aircraft. So this is not science fiction future. This is rapidly becoming the present.
That's it. I mean, the future's here. It's just unevenly distributed. And we show through that model of using reinforcement learning, we were able to show how quickly you can actually go on that. Because that notion of having an AI pilot was an idea on September the 1st, 2024. By May the 28th this year, the AI was actually flying that Gripen over the Baltic Sea. And so that transfer from the simulative environment out into the real world is something that we should become more comfortable with, because it did seem for a long time like science fiction to a lot of people. But actually, the way that simulative environments have developed, including through reinforcement learning and through the breakthroughs in AI that we've seen recently, have changed that equation substantially.
I'll ask as a sort of bridge onto that. It's all very well flying these things, but I do wonder. There's a lot of talk about the ethical and moral side to these. You know, I've been flippant, Cyberdyne Technologies, the Terminator, Rise of the Machines. But on a serious note, it's one thing flying an aeroplane. It's quite another releasing weapons. It's quite another, you know, actually bringing death and destruction to others in a complicated environment. We don't have time today, but the number of times that we've used courageous restraint not to deliver weapons because there's something that just doesn't feel right. How do you think we're going to have to literally gain confidence in that? Where do you think that conversation lies? Where are the boundaries, and how are we going to get ourselves more comfortable in that?
Well, Sean, I think you've hit the nail on the head of understanding why we're actually not making progress as fast as we could be in actually getting this technology into our warfighters' hands, because our imagination of artificial intelligence has collectively been colonized to some extent by things like the Terminator and Skynet. But that's science fiction. We're in the realm of science reality here, and there's a big difference in terms of what we see, because actually, in the history of military affairs, as you and Greg know very well, is one of delegating lethal authority to subordinates, be those subordinate officers, or to machines of different kinds, be that beyond visual range missiles, be it bombs that are used to deliver a particular effect outside of the line you can actually see. And that has been taken incredibly seriously over the years, as it continues to be now, which is why we invest such a lot in what we call assurance, which is about making sure the AI does what it's supposed to do and nothing more. But the principle remains the same. In order to delegate lethal authority, you have to be able to trust the system or the person you're delegating it to. And so to do that, you train remorselessly until that person or that system can be shown to actually follow those instructions to deliver within the bounds of the authority that's been delegated. And then you test that, and you test it remorselessly. And because you've trained and tested, you can trust it. And the same principle applies here. But I think, Martin will tell you certainly, we're not yet at the stage where we've been able to push that into real experimenting to find out where the real problems do lie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's it's really interesting. AI evokes a very emotional response, doesn't it, as a technology? And it's either one end of the spectrum. It's either it's going to save the world or it's going to destroy civilization. When the reality is probably somewhere in the middle. And you probably know yourself. So if you're using AI in terms of whether it's ChatGPT, Copilot, or any of these productivity tools, you learn how to use it. You learn what its pitfalls are. You learn what it can and can't do. You learn how to manipulate it and how to employ it to your best advantage. And that principle still retains in the military sphere. So again, experimentation in the synthetic environment, building the trust, understanding what it can and can't do, taking that and understanding what risks you're taking into the live environment to validate, to operate with. But ultimately, we can't stand and admire the problem. We need to get our hands dirty and we need to actually start working with the technology and get on that journey. We need to get on that journey now, understanding when is the technology going to be ready that we can make that seamless transition into operational capability
Do you
as
think?
quick.
Do you think it will AI? I mean, we'll let this go after that. But do you think AI will ever be able to provide the same nuanced judgments that the individual currently makes? I look at one of the reasons where when you're old and grey, but you're probably at some of your most valuable making decisions, is you've gained loads and loads of experience. Why is a driver of our age a far lower insurance premium than a 17-year-old who feels very confident but actually is a danger to shipping on the roads? It's all about experience, it's all about judgments, it's learning. I'm still not quite sure, maybe it's just my lack of comprehension, how you transition from a series of ones and noughts and logic
Yeah.
into a judgment conversation.
So I mean that underpins that what you just outlined there underpins the rationale between reinforcement-based learning in terms of its experiential learning for the machine. And if I put that in a combat air scenario, you have a 1v1 beyond visual range in a simulator where you're able to basically faster than real time undertake adversarial self-play. So it's agent versus agent, and they do that thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of times, where in 14 days you can develop an AI agent that equates to 50 years of that pilot flying every second of every day and has seen every possible permutation of the environment that you've given it. So what you end up with is an AI agent that has the experience and the knowledge of what you have trained it against. So clearly the caveat there is it's dependent on the training, it's dependent on the scenario and the reward structure you give it. But that's the whole premise behind this third wave of AI, is that it is absolutely, it can reason, there is context to it, and it can form judgment based on experience.
And that's why we have to do those experiments and watch very, very carefully to work out where those limits are. But I think we've also got to be clear about the promise of that, the potential of it, because you stand to create the kind of AI pilot that has the reflexes of a 20-year-old and the experience of Greg. So I mean that's a fairly lethal combination, to put it mildly. But also I
You're so
think
right.
yeah, yeah, there we go. And also you don't get things like a risk-averse pilot or a more impulsive pilot. You get the pilot for the circumstance because the AI builds in all of those characteristics. And so you could actually have sort of multiple personality traits reflected within one AI agent. But again, we do have to test it and train it.
No, I get it. There's a lovely story, isn't there, about the War of the Western Desert? How, Monty would sit with a picture of Rommel on his desk, and it wasn't because he fancied Rommel. It was because he would at those moments he'd look into his eyes and go, "What are you going to do next? What is it in your background? I've read your books, I've studied your strategy, I've studied." What and it was that sense of the human condition which is about warfare, and maybe I'm just being a luddite here, but that feels to me part of the whole essence of warfare, and I wonder whether you can ever teach that.
Warfare in its nature is a human endeavor. It is a contest of wills between people, and never underestimate the ability of a human mind to do something completely unpredictable that machine has never even possibly thought of. I don't think anyone is suggesting that we're going to automate war, and that war in its nature will become machine versus machine while we sit at home, make a cup of tea, and just let them fight it out. Absolutely not. It is, and always will be and remain a contest of wills, at the human level. This is about identifying, though, what is the machine good at and what is the human good at, and pairing the two. The machine can do calculations, it can sift through data at a rate a human mind simply cannot fathom or deal with. But then also the human has the nuance and has that unpredictability. So how do you best pair both of them so that you deliver, that true battle winning capability between both?
I think that's 100% right. I mean, exactly. The nature of warfare doesn't change. Clausewitz was onto this. Sean, you've been talking about it very clearly, and it is that human to human contest. But the character of war can change. And if we look at what happens in Ukraine at the moment, without affecting the character of warfare by really using this new technology to its full potential, you end up with a World War One style stalemate, the kind of attritional warfare that no army would want to fight. But we've dealt with this kind of problem before. We've dealt with the need to intervene into the character of warfare by using technology properly to actually get out of the trenches and to restore maneuver. And I think that's a similar kind of challenge that we face again today.
First of all, you'll all get an award for bringing up Clausewitz. That's the first time this podcast has brought up the famous German general.
Well, it might be the first time that Clausewitz and then Sean were brought in together in the same.
They've always been in the same category in my book. But joking aside, let's bring this to sort of a reality. I mean, we know about the Trinity House Treaty. It's an Anglo-German treaty to talk about greater cooperation. You are obviously a company that bridges both those sides of the nations. We are potentially heading towards a US provided solution in many of these technologies because they've got the mass and the development to take us there. But where do we, Europe, UK, Germany, go in order to sort of steal a march, or at least, become a more sovereign capability? And how do we do that practically?
Well, you mentioned the phrase sovereign capability, which is key to all of this, because however you see the future of geopolitics, however you see the future of transatlantic relations, the exam question posed to Europe is how to get stronger. And whether that's to be a stronger partner within a strong transatlantic partnership or to be able to act on our own when necessary to defend against the threats that we clearly see from Russia, but also to stay competitive in that long-term struggle against authoritarians. So we have to be able to build that sovereign capability. And that's obviously where we at Helsing really try and intervene into that to actually provide that for countries such as the UK and Germany. And that means producing in Europe. It means supplying to European customers, i.e. the governments involved, but working with them as the kind of mission partner that they really need to answer the kind of questions we've been talking about today. How to make the best use of technology, how to then procure it in ways that mean you can get the advantage when you actually need it. And also, what knock-on effects does that have for your economy and how you need to produce it? And it's interesting to see that it was a German study, the Kiel Institute. They talked about the amplifier effect you get from investing in defense. And they said if you invest in traditional defense technology, you get a zero point 0.6 boost. So if you invested 100 billion, you get a 60 billion boost in your economy. But with the new defense tech, primarily around AI, you get 150 billion euro boost. So a 1.5 times multiplier because it has this dual use implication and because it actually pushes forward our technological base. So Helsing works with governments across Europe to try and develop sovereign capability, but also to answer those bigger questions, because I mean, ultimately, we're all pushing in the same direction here. Helsing was founded to use AI to protect democracies and indeed to ensure that we have a strong Europe.
And how do we fare on skill sets in terms of comparison with the likes of America? I mean, the obvious comparator is somebody like Palantir, which is a behemoth. But are we able to attract the talent and build in a way that's going to be able to compete?
Yes, we are. And this, I mean, one of the untold stories of the AI revolution has actually been European talent powering a lot of the US labs that have done a lot to push this forward. But something that we're particularly proud of is the ability to actually attract AI talent into huge concentrations with Helsing because of our mission commitment. We've attracted people from Facebook's AI program at Meta, from the field of precision agriculture, which was one that I didn't know too much about beforehand, but across the range of different AI applications. We see some of the most talented people in Europe moving to the defense industry. Why? Because they want to put their talents to actually addressing the challenge of our times as they see it. And the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine was absolutely key in that, in waking a lot of people up to be able to say, hang on a minute, there's something much more serious going on here than I'd realized was happening before. How can I play my part? And it's great to see such tech talent coming together in concentrations with us and others who are doing things like us, to actually use what is one of Europe's big advantages, which is our innovative talent.
Sorry, Martin, you were away the other night. There was an event going on. I wonder how much of this is limited by technological capability, how much of it's limited by the people involved in it, and also how much of it's limited by the culture of some of the defence leaders who maybe do not see the potential of this, that largely see a bunch of snake oil salesmen peddling a very expensive, bit of software.
So can I, yeah, I mean, I'll double down on what Ben just said there in terms of from a warfighting, from a defense procurement, from a military industrial perspective. I think this what a great opportunity that presents ourselves in terms of having access to these new companies, VC backed, non-taxpayer funded R&D, an entire skill set of people who never previously would have worked in traditional defense. And I've seen that firsthand, having spent 20 years in the Air Force, going to a company like Helsing, surrounded by people who take a fundamentally new approach to this. And it's interesting from my point of view, because I tend to think that, we look at technology in terms of making our processes more efficient. Actually, there are some technologies that come along that fundamentally question what our processes are and how we do those processes.
When Greg and I joined the military, largely military capability, we were the front runners. So we would go out, here's our requirements, industry, go and sort them out, have a competition. Oh yes, we like you. And therefore you get the money, off you go. This whole market, this whole environment of AI, it feels like, first of all, there are massive advances going on far beyond what the defense market is doing. So how on earth do we engage in the defense into this? And quite deliberately, what is the relationship with industry? Because Greg, we were talking before the podcast. The defence equipment plan, is it, that's due out shortly? There's the new National Armaments Directorate. There feels like there's the answer to the Maiden's Prayer. All these things are going to be solved. But it feels to me fundamentally this is a very, very different approach we have to have with industry, some sort of partnership approach, and also with an eye on the export market. Because the one thing that we are very good at is at the war fighting end, we practice what we preach, and actually we're part of a much bigger ecosystem. Is there a different approach that we should be taking with industry that's more focused on partnership, more focused on Team UK, and alliances with our partners?
I mean, my point of view, simple answer is yes, absolutely. I think that what the technology is offering us now is a very exciting opportunity for the future to totally reimagine a military tech complex in the UK, focused on mission partnership. Not, I like you used to define a requirement, take 2 years to have a beautifully curated user requirement document and then put out to competition. No, we need to sit down at the earliest stages of concept development with industrial partners and say, this is the problem. These are the key attributes that I need to be able to deliver in delivering that outcome. How can we do this together?
And are you confident that the MOD and DNS are thinking that way too? Because in the past, we've gone to the normal suspects for platforms, BAE Systems, Babcock, or whatever. And we built something called the complex weapons strategy, where we basically partnered with the likes of MBDA for that, because there was a recognition that there was a strategic partnership that needed to endure. Is there a sense that strategic partnership is the same for AI?
So I think it's different. I think the industrial complex that we have now has been built up and has been generated over decades over the core hardware requirements. It's going to need a fundamental realignment for software. I think, primes absolutely, still have their place. It's not an either or type conversation. It's an and conversation. How can you best blend what the primes do using? We still need to build aircraft. We still need to build ships. There are still those kind of programs that need to be done. What we need, though, is a more flexible, dynamic procurement process that can cater for both, that basically has all the right process and checks and balances in when we need to build the sort of like the capital programs, but also can then onboard and can rapidly develop the software type capabilities that ultimately, this is all about pace. All we want and what we need is to get the best capability in the hands of the warfighters as soon as possible. It's about pace, and it's about unlocking the latent potential that is there.
And in some ways, that goes back to actually saying, how did we used to do things? What are the best of the ways we've done this in the past? And how can we show ourselves out of the maze that we seem to have got ourselves into in the last 30, 35 years or so? Because if you look at times of massively disruptive technological shift, be that the development of first fast steel monocoque aeroplanes or radar or so on in the 1930s, you get a mixture of development in the private sector, in public sector driven research, and then you get military applications of it being worked out through proper warfighting concepts. And Martin and I have talked about this before. I mean, the Dowding system and the various technologies that went into that, the world's first integrated air defense system, is a really good example of different technologies coming together and being in effect co-developed through requirements that are set, but also through the imagination, the concept-led development of how Dowding wanted the RAF to fight. If you look at some of the other radical technologies of precision-guided weapons, stealth technology, and so on, a lot of that development was done in the private sector, encouraged, yes, by government and by militaries, but it came from different parts of the militaries, different parts of the civilian government establishment as well. In the last 35 years or so, we've really got ourselves into a mess of trying to actually prevent any bad things from happening in our procurement, so elimination of risk through bureaucratic process. But what that actually does is store up the big risk that you won't be mastering the kind of technologies that you need to. And as you mentioned, I mean, procuring hardware is very different than procuring software, but still some of the same principles apply in terms of you have to have an idea of where the technology can take you. You have to have an idea of how you want to fight, and you have to have an idea of how you're going to fund it. And getting that stuff right and cutting it back down to basics is going to be extremely important going forward.
So, can you give us an example of a country that does it well then? I mean, are there any exemplars that you go, they've actually got one system for the big stuff, and they've got a different system. You talked about Dowding. I mean, we've used, Greg and I have used the Schneider Trophy as an example of, that was a competition, encouraged lots of innovation, and without that, we wouldn't have had the Spitfire. And therefore, is there something missing? Is there another country that actually is doing this well?
So, I mean, I would highlight Israel off the top of my head in terms of how they do it, and they fundamentally they seem to be good at breaking the barriers between the operator and the warfighter and the industry and the developer. We have layers of air capability staffs and DNS staffs. Israel, and caveated with the fact they have a very different strategic environment and threat environment, which has forced this kind of situation and their more dynamic and rapid procurement ability to develop that kind of capability. Absolutely. But they are, I would offer, are a good example of how you can actually blend the industrial base and your warfighting capability very effectively.
It's also
Yeah.
interesting to see that
Go on.
both UK and Germany, when supplying to Ukraine, managed to get things done quickly. And a lot of other European countries too. I mean, we think of the special task forces that were set up in the UK around Kindred and so on to really accelerate procurement for including some leading edge technologies. And I mean, anyone who's known my work on Germany over the years has known I've not been shy of criticizing where it's been due, but I have to give credit to Germany. In the last year or so, they've really accelerated the process here and are starting to come up with very innovative, very flexible, agile, and fast ways of actually procuring some of the new technologies. And we're going to start to see the public outcomes of that very soon. And I think that's been a realization that they had to move at the speed of need rather than moving at the speed of the old bureaucracy. So with the right political will in their sails, the bureaucrats have found a way to go about it.
And it's not doom and gloom in the UK either, right? There are pockets of really good, promising developments and progress. Commercial X has done some brilliant work in terms of, getting people onboarded, very quickly, dealing with ambiguity, very quick contract arrangements. Asgard, is an example with the British Army where they were able to be flexible and using R&D exemptions to get companies on board. The intent is absolutely there, and the new NAD has absolutely set a stall out in terms of what he's after and some of the key messages he's putting together, and with the intent that is laid out in the Strategic Defence Review and the Defence Industrial Strategy, we're absolutely, the intent is there. It's about, well, let's get after it.
It is, and then it's about how you scale the speed, how you go from those pockets of really innovative ways of doing things to make that the new normal.
How AI is massively going to be brought to bear is about the fact that, you know, we can't we can't process what we have right now, the data that what we have right now. We can't organize the data in the right way, and then we can't process it so that basically all that information that's in there, it's about, how do we get that insights out of that as quickly as possible? And it's about pace, it's about adaptation. And that is where AI is absolutely going to be brought to bear. You're absolutely right. We have all these things out there. We have all the sensors out there. This is why the emphasis right now is on the digital targeting web, because the first thing we need to do is that we need to connect what we have right now, which have been bought and procured in nice, neat, stovepiped systems. And we need to find a way to integrate them. And we need to find a way that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that is where AI, and that's where the initial emphasis on it needs to be, is that how do we bring all these disparate things together so that we generate a whole understanding and a comprehension that previously it's just been too difficult to do. Previously the decision has always been precision or mass. We don't need the numbers of aircraft that we have right now because you can deliver the same effect with precision guided munitions, which means you need less aircraft to deliver them. But what you now have and what we're seeing in Ukraine is we've got precision and mass. Because what AI is doing is that you're able to take these mass drones and you're able, using AI terminal guidance, you're able to deliver them in a way that is very precise. So now you've got precision and mass, not a distinction of precision or mass.
But I think what it might tell us is we've been doing AI for years.
We
You know, a
have.
sidewinder uses artificial intelligence in that
So,
case.
but Greg, this is why they're saying, right, this is the third wave of AI. The first one was in the 50s and the 60s, which was rules-based systems, if then else, that type stuff. In the 80s and the 90s, you then had the second wave, which was statistical methods, trying to pick out patterns and data. This is the third wave, which is taking us to the next level, which is about experiential learning, context, reasoning, making decisions, aiding decision makers. That's, so AI is absolutely not new, and I don't think anyone would argue with that. It's the fact that we are now in this really transformational stage of AI where we're actually into the context and reasoning element of it.
We designed Brimstone to do exactly that with a millimetric wave sensor that detected tanks. We fired it in the Nellis range, not the Nellis range, the China Lake ranges. What did it hit? The generator in the container, shipping container, because it saw a metal box. And a metal box is either a school bus or a tank or a generator container. So we suddenly realized that this millimetric wave sensor wasn't as accurate as it was. If you now design in a beautiful chip that can see a T-72 in every detail, what does it see when it's one that's covered in wire and a giant drone cage that looks like a moving hedge? So actually here, my concern is we're promising utopia, and utopia actually doesn't arrive. It's one thing to hit refineries that are static and are easily definable to a scene matching target system. But when you're now trying to hit agile targets that are either underground or you're detecting through ELINT rather than just visual, or tanks are no longer looking like tanks because they've covered it in shit. I think we are in danger here of promising something that is going to work 100% of the time and actually might prove in a war to be not as effective as we think.
I mean, that's the history of weapons development.
Right.
In
Exactly.
many ways, there's been a lot.
Yeah, and we haven't got much better at it. And
well, but we have in some cases and in some cases not, because some things do work, and it's the question of drawing on why those actually work, how they were actually be able to develop to overcome those teams.
Yeah, but as we demonstrated in Iran, you do that by writing down the SEAD. You having a SEAD campaign that writes down the air defense system, and then you fly a B-2 stealth bomber that didn't need to be a B-2 stealth bomber because nothing was going to shoot at it anyway, dropping an old-fashioned gravity weapon down a hole. So the idea that we've moved into some 21st century modern way of waging war.
Yeah, I don't think that showed the modern way of war either. I agree with you. That was a legacy effect delivered by a legacy system, which precisely one country in the world has access to. Now, you could say that other countries have access to similar things that could give you similar effect. But overall, I'm not sure that's what captures the dynamic we're in, because I think, and I tried to say this at the beginning, perhaps I didn't say it clearly. A lot of the stuff we're seeing at the moment is the back end of the last big change. It's about an evolutionary change to fulfill the potential of that revolution in military affairs of network-centric warfare, precision strike, precision sensing in a way that we've seen. But I think there's another change coming from the kind of disruptive technology that we've seen of an order of magnitude of difference. Now, we don't know what shape that's going to take yet, but AI plus quantum plus some other technologies that are coming through, I think you could say that is likely to have a serious impact if we use it in the right way. And I think the race for AI in particular is going to be crucial in that. And this is why, the Manhattan Project for AI stuff comes up, because we want to be ahead of that change, which will be a qualitatively different thing when it happens.
Yeah, there's no guarantees, right? And this is the key. People who try and put forward technology is fundamentally changing the nature of war, just don't understand the business that they're in, right? What you're talking about there and what you're highlighting are those fundamental things in warfare that do not change. There is ambiguity. There is, that absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying, and I don't think I'm hoping we're not saying that. In my mind, it is a tool to solve a problem. It's not a case of AI is the answer, what is the question, and this is going to solve all of our problems. Absolutely not. Certainly not in my mind.
And what Martin said about not changing the nature of warfare is obviously correct. And it's not the technology that brings change. It's the technology that brings the possibility of change if you get the other stuff right, if you get the doctrine, the operational concepts, the imagination right of how you use this stuff.
And you can only do that if you embrace the technology, work with it, experiment it, and test it.
What I love about the conversation is that actually it's exactly what you guys have been saying, is this isn't the answer to the Maiden's Prayer today. but this has the potential to be transformative. The question is, what are you going to do with it? And I was thinking of the Schneider Trophy. You know, at the time, nobody give a shit about why does it matter how fast a plane is? It's still going between A and B. It's just a little bit faster. Come the day, suddenly go, shit, it really is important. And therefore, is this one of those capabilities that unless we embrace it, unless we find its potential and how it's going to be best employed, our adversaries might well pick that up earlier. And the speed of decision making, the OODA loops, all that sort of thing, that has never changed. And therefore, could this impact it? Well, Greg, that was fascinating. We started a lot of the discussion, particularly around AI, and it was more a generic capability, but it very quickly got into a pithy conversation about, is this a game-changing technology, or is it simply the evolution of some very, very clever part of the defense technology sphere? And it's about how we use it, and therefore not about an answer yet. It's just a potential solution in the future.
Yeah, just to reassure our listeners, I mean, we don't start these podcasts with an absolute understanding of what's going to come up in the conversation. I mean, we obviously try and put a bit of structure to it. But I found myself swinging quite wildly in my head whilst that conversation was going on about, God, is this really, something fantastical, or is it just we're just getting better at doing the old thing as we've always done? We're just evolving. So is it evolution? Is it revolution? If you want to use those terms. I think the trick is that you sometimes label, when you use the AI label, it can be all things to all people. It's a bit like drones, and Helsing covered that very well. There are drones at this end and drones at that end. And I think there's AI that is a relatively fundamental basic stage that I don't think any of us will have an issue with. But there's the autonomy element of AI, which is a much different level of sophistication, because at the moment we are evolving in defense. We're talking about how to bring this technology in on top of what we've already got and make what we've got work better. Who wouldn't want that? There's still a question in my head that I don't think I've even answered. I think Helsing have got an answer. Maybe they won't reveal the full plan, but there is an answer that takes you to a very different place that's far beyond what we've yet considered.
No, I do wonder whether I'm probably as guilty as the next person at thinking that AI was a bit like a salesman flogging a Klingon death ray. This will be the answer. Thank God we've got it. And I don't think that's where they're coming from at all. What they're saying is that you've got lots of very, very capable sensors, lots of very capable ways of bringing in information now. But actually, what do you do with it all? And how do you create some synergies with all of these different stovepipes of information? There's far too much there for an individual mind to sift through. Therefore, how do you put the human in the position where he can make the judgments, but make those informed judgments by synthesizing all of this morass, this ocean of data out there into a droplet that means that you can make sense of it? And I think that was the challenge that was laid. It isn't about, right, I'll have 3 of those. It's going, we've got all this sexy equipment. We've got to be more clever at creating an ecosystem where we make sense of it. And I think that's where they were focusing, where AI may deliver effect in the future.
Yeah, I think that came out clearer and clearer as the conversation went on. And I think in my head, I better understand it from my own point of view. I mean, it's a bit like the promise of Internet of Things, yeah, that in your house, so I'm sure yours is like mine, I've got a multiple of stuff that sits on the internet and allegedly is useful. Half of it isn't. It doesn't talk to it. Nothing talks to anything else. So it's carnage. And if the power goes off, it's all buggered anyway. So, but the idea that in a military ecosystem, that every sensor and every piece of data can be analyzed and then passed on and then used to its maximum effect is the holy grail that you and I have sought for years. Unfortunately, a lot of it was based on eyeball and human error. What we're now talking about is how much of that can we now take out of the system and make the things that we have bought already work far better than they have hitherto. What's not to like?
So what, if we were to give a one-liner, what's the so what for the defence review?
Ooh, a one-liner. I mean, I think the so what is it clearly has the potential to make us better. I think, what did the army use? 20 times more lethal by whatever the date was. And nobody really questioned, well, hang on a minute, where did you get to that number from? And how do you get to that number? And how do you even prove that number? But if yesterday you were able to kill a tank every 10 minutes by processing data and firing a weapon, you can now kill 20 tanks in 5 minutes. Okay, fine, I get that. And I think that's the MOD is in a relatively parlous state because of decades of underinvestment. Can AI rebuild back some of that capability at a relatively modest cost without having to pursue buying more ships, more airplanes, more tanks, which we might need anyway? Then I think it is a very quick way of potentially getting back some of that mass that we've wished away. And clearly that's the way that Ukraine has dealt with Russia, by building back their capability through that means. Now, I'm not suggesting, and I don't think that Helsing suggested either, we fight in the same way that Ukraine did. But we've got the advantage here. We've got a few years, maybe hopefully a few years of time to get this right now, rather than try and reinvent in contact, which is never ideal.
No, it'd be really interesting to see, because the defence review, I think one of the things that never goes out of favour is this OODA loop, where you have got to make a decision cycle and make key decisions. They have to be informed. At the moment, how do you make sense of this ocean of information? And anything that can help the commanders make timely, informed decisions seems to me to make sense. As you said, we've got lots of these, your little lawnmower, that's autonomous lawnmower going around, ferreting around the garden, looking a little bit nuts as it goes. But it is this advent of technology. How do we bring it together? How do we make it together battle winning? And I hope that's the lesson for the Defence Review. This feels like it's the glue that'll make it work.
Yeah, it might be autonomous, but Muggins here pays the electric bill to make it work each time and has to change the battery. So, it only goes so far. I think it is obviously the big idea. I mean, you can't move without someone saying AI. I think it's got to be the future. I think the fundamental question now is, how do we integrate this at pace? In a way that we are comfortable with. And as Martin and Ben both said, we're not good at buying software. We're quite good at might not be that good at hardware either. But the software is a very different space. And coming up with the ways of managing that and accepting within that sort of development cycle is a challenge.